Hello weekend warriors, it is Sam from DIY Huntress, and today I'm going to show you how I made a cedar bench with a chevron pattern in just a few days of work. I'm really excited about this one, so let's get started. This project is sponsored by Burns-O-Matic. If you were around last year, you might remember that I made my parents an outdoor chevron coffee table for their back patio. And since the table has been holding up really well, I have wanted to make a matching bench to go along with it. Now, when I made that table, I made it using cedar, and I wanted to do the same thing with this bench. So to get started, I did have to mill down my cedar into some custom sizes. But as always, you can find the full list of materials and dimensions that I used for this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. If I'm being honest here, I would have loved to have made my life easy by just using the lumber that I was able to pick up at my local home improvement store. However, I had to order my lumber online because not every store is letting people in just yet. And because of that, some of the lumber was in really rough shape, and that's why I had to mill it down on my table saw into custom sizes. But after cutting everything down to size, my first order of business was to focus on making the frame for the bench, and that is what I am doing here using the 2x2 that I milled out of some 2x4s that I got from the home improvement store. So when I made the table last year, I actually made a frame and then nailed the design on top of the frame, but I wanted to do something a little differently here. Instead, I actually built a frame and then added the design inside. I know this probably doesn't make sense just yet, so hang on for a second. You'll see what I mean in a little bit. But before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about this frame for a second. So I took all of the center pieces as well as the two shorter side pieces and drilled pocket holes into the ends of them. And once the pocket holes were drilled, it was then time to assemble the bench with the pocket holes facing down. Now, this is just a personal preference, but whenever I'm using pocket holes, I do like to try to hide them as best as I can, and I decided to face the pocket holes on the bottom part of the bench. So right now the bench is upside down, and the reason I did this is that when you are looking at the bench from the top up, you will not see the joinery. Another important thing to note here is that I did use a waterproof glue that is actually rated to be outdoor specific. I've linked the details to that on my blog post as well, but the reason I did that is because the bench will be outdoors and I want it to hold up as best as it can for as long as it can. Also, as I assembled my bench, I continued to check for square, which was actually really difficult because, of course, the lumber I was using was just not in the best shape, and so it was warped or curved in certain spots. So I tried my best to keep this thing as square as possible to make my life easier later in the process. This project seriously gave me a run for my money. I got frustrated so many times with this thing because it was not perfectly square, but I made it work, so that's the good news. Once the frame was built, my work was not done here because I needed to create some sort of ledge to apply all of those decorative pieces to. So I took some leftover cedar cutoffs from when I milled up my lumber and I cut them into 3/4 inch strips that I then attached to the frame using wood glue and nail gun. I actually made sure to let this part of the project dry completely for a couple of hours before even considering touching it because I needed this ledge to be super strong so that it could hold on to all of the chevron pieces. After I was done attaching the ledge, it was time to cut all of the pieces for the chevron pattern, and I have the dimensions for what I used on my website, but honestly, the boards that I was using were giving me such a tough time that it's probably best to just measure as you go. At this point, I was also kind of having some trouble figuring out the spacing, so I really just started by cutting little triangles using a 45-degree miter, and then I used those triangles to insert these pieces in the middle of the bench. Now, originally I was going to attach these pieces from the top using my nailer, just like I did with the chevron table that I made, but I just didn't like the way that the nail holes looked in these pieces, so I decided to glue things in place, flip the bench over for every single piece I attached, and then nail it from the backside. This definitely took a while and made this project a lot longer than it probably should have been. However, it did end up looking pretty sweet to not have any nail holes on the top of the piece. Once those middle pieces were permanently attached, I did decide to add some corner pieces to the bench to help me figure out the spacing. However, just a quick disclaimer, I actually ended up removing these later and then cutting custom pieces to fit there. So ultimately, don't do what I did there. Just leave those out, figure out the spacing, and then cut those pieces last. While most of the chevron pieces that I cut were pretty straightforward, they were just simple 45-degree angle cuts, there were a couple that were a little weird because of the framing issues. So for those, I brought the piece over to the frame, marked where I needed to make my trims or my cuts, cut those on my miter saw, and then brought them back to the bench and installed them. And just like I did with the other pieces, I glued them from the top and then flipped the entire bench over and then nailed them into place from the underside, just again to hide those brad nails because I wanted the top of the bench to look super sleek and super clean. I also used a small scrap wood spacer so that the spacing was consistent between all of the pieces. Luckily, it was actually pretty warm outside when I was doing this project, so the glue began to set pretty quickly, which helped to keep these pieces in place. But I think if I were to do something like this again, I'd probably clamp a couple of pieces to the frame at once and then flip the whole frame over and hit all of those pieces at once as like a big batch. Either way, at some point, I finally got into a groove where I was able to add a lot of pieces and I knew the spacing. However, again, I was working with wood that wasn't completely straight, which made this so difficult. So I did have to do some trial and error when it came to fitting some of these chevron pieces, which is why I definitely suggest that if you are doing a build like this, to double check your measurements as you go. Honestly, I was so happy to be done with this thing after working on it for a full day. Seriously. This one tested my dang patience today. So happy this is done. Calling it a day. I need Sour Patch Kids. This is gonna sound downright crazy, but I was so over the patterning that the next day I was actually looking forward to changing things up, and I actually didn't mind sanding this. Like, who am I? To be fair though, cedar is pretty easy to sand, so using my belt sander helped to make everything super flush pretty quickly, and then I eventually sanded the entire piece to 120 grit before adding some water, raising the grain, allowing it to dry, and then sanding the entire bench to 220 grit. I did also make sure to throw some hand sanding in there as well because I wanted to get into all of the little nooks and crannies and also sand down some of those hard edges on the chevron pieces. But once I was done sanding this piece, it was then time to finish it, and I did this using an outdoor spray urethane, which made getting into all of those little nooks and crannies so much easier. I ended up doing about 2 to 3 coats of the spray urethane on the top and then allowed that to dry, and as that dried, I began to work on the bottom part of the bench. Now this was pretty straightforward. I actually cut all of my pieces using 2x4s, but originally I did think that I wanted to make a base that looked exactly like the table, so I did cut some leg pieces as well as some frame pieces and then decided last minute that I didn't want a frame and then completely scrapped the frame pieces. And so since I was making these legs to look like rectangles, I basically needed the 4 leg pieces and then needed 2 bottom frame and 2 top frame pieces, and I drilled pocket holes in the ends of each one of those frame pieces before attaching them to the legs using that waterproof glue and exterior pocket hole screws. At this point, I then ran a dry fit of everything, and I was pretty stoked about the fact that I decided to not keep the frame pieces because I thought that the legs paired with the top of the bench looked pretty perfect in my humble opinion. At this point in the video, I'm pretty sure you might be sick of hearing me talk about this chevron table I made last summer, but the reason I bring it up again is because that table has a torched base, and I wanted to do the same thing for the legs of this bench. So to do that, I used my Bernzomatic TS4000 torch and a propane tank, and I applied the heat to the cedar, which turned it black. Now, this is a process that's called Shosugiban, and it's really awesome because it is a process that not only makes the wood look cool, but also helps waterproof it and preserve it. Now, after torching every part of these legs, my job wasn't done here yet because next step was to remove all of the excess charcoal and debris using a stiff bristle brush. You could also use a wire brush here, that's traditionally what's done, but I always worry that the wire brush is going to mark up or damage the cedar, so I prefer something a little gentler. But after removing all of the debris, I then finished the legs with the same clear urethane that I used on the top of the cedar bench, and this is just going to prevent any of that charcoal from rubbing off on somebody's hands and will also give it an added layer of protection, which never hurts. I then let them sit aside and dry, and once they were dry, I added them to the top of the bench by marking where I wanted them to go, pre-drilling holes, and then screwing them into place using decking screws. I then gave the entire bench one last finish with that outdoor spray urethane, and at that point, this project was done. There's something about chevron patterning in furniture design that makes me super happy. Obviously, I have a lot of these types of projects on my YouTube channel, and I'm not really sure I'm going to be slowing down with them anytime soon. I am definitely excited about the way that this project turned out, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Summertime means that I am on vacation from my full-time job for a while, which means lots of time for building and lots of projects on my channel. So if you are interested in some more projects, definitely make sure to subscribe. But in the meantime, friends, thank you so much for watching, for always supporting what I do. I will see you soon with another project. And until then, happy DIYing.